one of the major purchasers of Russian oil, perhaps India, we're still waiting for them to follow through on their promise to back away from Russian oil, or China or others. If they back away from purchasing Russian oil, which is the big, big thing that fuels the Russian war machine, it may bring the economy to its knees because it is a war economy for the most part. And the other thing that could happen is perhaps his generals or his elites around him may see that enough is enough and he could be forced out.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Kate Gerbeau. And today we are talking to a Ukraine-based global affairs analyst with more than 2 decades experience in humanitarian work and international journalism. Michael Bociurkiw is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and the founder of World Briefing Report on Substack. Michael, welcome back to Frontline. It's great to see you again.
Great to see you again. Thank you for having me.
So, Michael, you're joining us from Bangkok, and I'm going to ask you about your trip and what you're doing there a little later on. But the 4th anniversary of the war in Ukraine was a moment to reflect this week. What's been going through your mind?
Oh, so much. But, one thing that really struck me, I mean, aside from the huge civilian deaths, over 15,000 according to the UN, uh, between 40 and 50,000 injuries at least, of course, millions displaced. But, it's reached a point in this war where, well, a couple of things really, you and I, over the time we've been talking, especially during the war, have been talking a lot about the amazing resilience of ordinary Ukrainians, how they've stood up to Russian aggression. And however, this winter has been particularly brutal. Number one, because of very prolonged cold snap with temperatures overnight reaching into minus 20s. And then on top of that, Russians striking relentlessly on power infrastructure. So when power goes out, the heating, central heating goes out, water goes out as well. And for some people, including even in urban centers, they've been going weeks without, for example, warm water. So as much as we like to talk about the resilience of Ukrainians, especially in Odessa, the port city where I'm usually based, people are reaching a breaking point. I had an op-ed in the Globe and Mail in Canada this week that talked about that, how society has changed, and that we have to be careful, I think, now how we refer to the Ukrainians because even here in Asia, the metaphor is used that one of the strongest things around is a a bamboo branch. But if you bend it enough, it will break. And the same thing with any society, really, after such pounding from an enemy force. The other thing that is particularly sad, you and I have spoken previously about how, for example, military cemeteries are overflowing, but it's now got a point on the eastern parts of Ukraine that are still under government control that families who have lost loved ones are having to take the painful decision to exhume those bodies and transfer them to safer ground. And, it makes me think that when we've reached a point where even those who have paid the ultimate price are not given proper rest and dignity, it's a very, very sad state of the war. So it pains me to have to talk about this, and I talk to my Ukrainian friends and relatives back home a lot, but they are really having to make difficult decisions as well on whether to stay, whether to move. But let's hope that with spring not far away, things will change for the better.
Because my next question was going to be that Ukraine is emerging from this terrible, tough winter and those bombardments that you described and all of the kind of horrific experiences that people have been through, yet it's survived, hasn't it? I know you said that people are close to breaking point, but still Ukraine is there, still the people fighting on.
Yes, still the people are there, and still they will not allow any Ukrainian leader to swap territory for any other concessions. So the Russians currently, as you know, are demanding territory in eastern Ukraine, which they do not even control. But there's no way that could happen because of the principle of giving away that territory, number one. But of course, number two, when you suddenly consign potentially millions of Ukrainians to Russian occupation, which they've described to me as hell on earth, well, that just can't happen. So we're at a very difficult stage right now. And the other thing, Kate, is what's happening right now with no end in sight. It kind of reminds me when we were all in the midst of COVID and lockdown and feeling sorry for ourselves, stuck at home, and we couldn't see an end to that. And that's the same thing here. It makes you very anxious. It makes you kind of depressed when you can't see the end to things of life going back to normal. And one more thing we have to think about as well as governments and NGOs in various countries around the world that host Ukrainian refugees is we're now, of course, coming into year 5, and in some jurisdictions like Germany, Ukrainian asylum seekers now qualify for citizenship there. So the point here being is that they're putting down roots. Their kids are going to school there. They're learning the languages, and excuse me, we're talking about millions of Ukrainians. And will they come home when peace eventually comes? Because Ukraine also faces a demographic crisis in that regard. Ukraine needs people to rebuild. It can't all happen by foreigners or foreign assistance. So, one thing also on my mind very much these days.
And that impact on Ukrainian society, how does it look to you today when you're in Ukraine, when you're in Odessa?
Well, I interact as much as I can with locals. I have many friends and acquaintances. I talk to every single person I possibly can. Luckily for me, I speak fluent Ukrainian. And what they tell me is that Ukraine has to continue fighting. But the reality on the ground, and even the various chambers of commerce and other friends of Ukraine say Ukraine is open for business. Well, business is really, really struggling, especially small businesses, because you have a lack of foot traffic. A lot of people have left. A lot of men are not going out because they're afraid of being picked up by military police. And on top of that, you have to run a generator most of the time. It's an added expense. You don't know when the lights will be on, will the heating be on. And also, there's been additional taxes put onto people, on businesses and small entrepreneurs. So the squeeze is getting very, very much on them. And on top of that, of course, you have the daily bombardment, usually happening at night, of drones and missiles. And just before I left on this particular trip, for the first time ever, over my flat in Odessa, I had two waves of Russian drones over my head. One wave did not even trigger the air raid siren alarms, so not giving people the opportunity to flee for bomb shelters. I don't know, Kate, if that was a one off, but if the Russians have, you know, kind of fooled the system enough so that alarms don't go off, that's a very bad development. And I do notice too, because, during war, your senses become much more acute, but you notice this most minute changes, and there's even a different sound to these drones. They're faster, they're more powerful, and when they do eventually come down, either through interceptors or they crash into the ground, the explosions are much more lethal. In the particular swarm I told you about, it hit an amusement park for children about not even a kilometer away. A little bit further away, it hit a bunch of residential buildings, but it also damaged the building where the UN is headquartered in Odessa. So it feels like it's getting much more closer. And finally, it also feels that no inch of Ukraine is really safe anymore.
And did you have any idea how many drones were in this swarm?
Typically, you have several because within the typical Russian wave of drones, you have decoys, you have ones that may, for example, head towards Odessa and then abruptly turn to the north or to the west. So they usually come in big waves. But now, what the Russians are doing, including in the most recent attacks, they're combining ballistic missiles as well, as well as those drones. And there also has been one more development, which I did put in that Globe and Mail op-ed I referenced, is last week in the western city of Lviv, closer to the Polish border, there was what the Ukrainian government called a terrorist attack. It was a double tap homemade bomb that killed a police officer and injured very, very many civilians. If the Russians are getting up to these urban type of warfare tactics as well, that is a very, very scary development.
Yeah, indeed. And I can't imagine what it was like when you were experiencing that for the first time, then flying over your flat. What did you do? What was your reaction?
Well, most of us, if you were to head to the bomb shelter every time the alarms go off, you'd be in the bomb shelter all the time. So, I'm not going to say it's a fatalistic approach, but it's something, that we're aware of. And because, people need their sleep, they need to go to work and they need to take their kids to school in the morning. But that's the scary thing of these drones is you never know where they're going to fall. Some of them are kamikaze drones, but some of them may fall because they've been intercepted. And Kate, I have to bring this up. I absolutely have to because I am here in Thailand, and it's just been revealed in the past few days that Thailand has actually upped its game in terms of enabling Russia to evade sanctions. So, two things there. We've talked about this before, I think, is that Russia has been getting a lot of aviation parts for civilian aircraft through Thailand, but now it's been revealed that China is exporting many, many drones to Thailand, and then Thailand is exporting them to Russia. Uh, I don't know what type of pressure can be put on Thailand or other countries that enable Russia to bust sanctions, but this is a very, very sad development considering, the history Thailand has, considering the other countries that are involved in sanction busting. The history they have is that if you're going to stand up for the territorial integrity and sovereignty of your country, well, you also have to uh, actions speak louder than words.
Indeed, and I will ask you a bit more about sanctions evasion a little later. That's really interesting to hear that development, and very depressing, really. But on the battlefield, it was reported this week that Russia, some perhaps a little bit more hopeful news, that Russia is losing troops faster than it can replace them, and Ukraine has made the most significant gains since the Kursk Oblast incursion. It is proving it can still strike a blow.
The other development is that Elon Musk woke up one morning and decided that the Russians should not be benefiting from his Starlink communication system. So they were switched off, meaning that they're going to have a tougher time communicating amongst themselves and launching drones, all that. So the Ukrainians are really, really benefiting from that. Having said that, the Russians are also very good at finding workarounds to technological blocks on sanctions. So we'll see how long that advantage lasts. But, in terms of Russian losses, if anything, after 4 years of war, we're finding that Putin just doesn't care. And one reason for that is many of the men that are sent to the front line, either willingly or unwillingly, are from remote areas of Russia. So their losses are not really yet touching the elites in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And now we're seeing also more and more foreign mercenaries joining, many from Africa, many out of desperation, many being tricked to come to Russia. But the other thing that happened, according to the Ukrainian side, we haven't been able to verify it independently, is that the Ukrainians apparently launched their own homemade missile called the Flamingo that has incredible range, and it was reported to have struck energy infrastructure far, far inside Russia. If this is indeed the case, and they're able to produce more and more of these, then it's exactly what is supposed to happen in this current geopolitical environment is Ukraine can now lessen dependence on the UKs of the world, the Germans of the world, who often fall into this mindset of reluctance or fear of Putin to give Ukraine long-range weapons to strike far inside of Russia. Uh, but one last thing here, and this is, I think, what worries everybody, because the Ukrainians know very, very well the Russian mentality, is again that Putin doesn't care how many men he's going to lose. Because at the end of the day, is if this war is lost by the Russians, or if it's viewed to be a defeat, that is the end of Vladimir Putin. So he will do everything, everything in his power to win this war. And one final point here, because I think it's very, very important for your audience, is that that includes an expansion or an escalation of his hybrid warfare that now stretches to many, many parts of the globe, including to the United Kingdom.
And when you say that this war is so important to Putin and that he needs to win it or be seen to win it, life in Russia has changed incredibly over the last 4 years. Putin's tightened his grip and he's eliminating or imprisoning dissenters, and the economy is creaking, but not imploding. The war dead figures are soaring as well, but no victory he can claim at this moment. How potentially dangerous do you think this is for him at this time?
Well, we may be at a stage, Kate, where if one of the major purchasers of Russian oil, perhaps India, we're still waiting for them to follow through on their promise to back away from Russian oil, or China or others. If they back away from purchasing Russian oil, which is the big, big thing that fuels the Russian war machine, it may bring the economy to its knees because it is a war economy for the most part. And the other thing that could happen is perhaps his generals or his elites around him may see that enough is enough and he could be forced out. We don't know. But I think, like you said, he's done so much to really stamp out dissidents and opponents to his regime to the point where Russia does not even blink when it has to go to places like Spain and assassinate an opponent there or neutralize him or her. That's not a problem for them. They do it no matter what the cost. Uh, it doesn't matter if they have to go to the United Kingdom and torch a warehouse that carries humanitarian aid for Ukraine, or it doesn't matter to them if they're shamed or threatened by Keir Starmer for sending a spy ship masquerading as a merchant vessel to map submarine cables off the UK coast, and at the same time shining military grade laser beams into the eyes of our AF pilots. That's the type of person we're dealing with here. And it makes for a very scary scenario. One last thing, Kate, if I may, on this one. I am here in Asia. China has a very big shadow over this part of the region. And I still maintain to this day that there's one person left on the planet who could call Mr. Putin now or tomorrow and say, stop the war, and he will. It's not Donald Trump, it's Xi Jinping of China, the senior partner in that particular bilateral relationship.
Mm, yeah, it's an important point to make. Now, in your writings recently, you've been detailing how the Kremlin has adapted so well to outmaneuver sanctions and exploit the grey zones that you've described in international trade to sustain the war. What exactly do you see it's done, and how?
Well, it's a pretty scary scenario. In World Briefing, we produced a map that shows the flows, and it encircles the globe, and it goes through many, many different jurisdictions. And if I can relate this web of sanction busting networks to also what we saw happen the other day in the UN General Assembly, where there was, on the fourth anniversary, there was a vote in support of Ukraine and to end the war. And I gotta say, I was shocked by the number of countries that either abstained or voting against. Burundi, a small impoverished country in Africa, voting against it. Um, at least we saw the United States not do like they did last year. They actually voted against a similar resolution. This time they only abstained. Thailand did vote in favor. I was surprised to see that. But the point I'm making here is that you have Russia and China, for that matter, but Russia very aggressively working on allied states, particularly in Africa, to help them in terms of supplying energy, in terms of votes in the UN, but also in terms of sanction busting. And what we're seeing right now, from the start of the war, China said it was non-aligned when it came to this war, that it wasn't helping Russia. I now think we've seen a number of verified reports that tell us exactly the opposite, that they are. And it's not only, for example, drones coming through places like Thailand and make their way to Russia. It's also things like dual-use technology. Of course, Iran has a long history with Russia in this war. They were one of the first to supply drones, and they still do. In fact, there were reports that Iran was assisting the Russians with building a Shahed drone factory in Russia. And now we're reading that in return, the Russians are supplying the clerics in Iran with very sophisticated shoulder-mounted mobile missile launch systems. Scary stuff. There are also a number of other countries. We have read of some countries in Africa, like Thailand, helping Russia get aviation parts. But also, the other thing that has to happen, and this goes back, Kate, to what I said a bit earlier about the noose tightening around Mr. Putin's elite circle, is for heaven's sake, places like the UAE, the Russian wealthy Russians are the biggest purchasers of Russian luxury property there. If Mr. Trump, and a reminder that America does provide a bit of a security umbrella to that part of the world, if Mr. Trump were to say, okay, boys and girls, enough is enough, let's choke that off. Let's choke off the flow of Russian tourists to places like the UAE, like Turkey, but especially to places here like Thailand, where so many Russian tourists are in places like Phuket that they've already taken over the property sector, Airbnbs, even I'm told transport systems. So this has got to stop. I'm not against collective punishment, but I think we've seen in the past when that does happen as a kind of approach to constraining a dictator, you do have beneficial results at the end of the day.
Mm. How effective, when you describe all of these different examples, are the efforts to stop all of this? Because if you look at the case of Britain, for example, which has just put 300 new sanctions or announced them this week, says it's got innovative thinking to evade for those of trying to evade sanctions, and is planning to get tougher on the shadow fleet. And then you get these reports on Sky News of tankers like blatantly sailing through the English Channel, for example. And then you get the example that President Zelensky was saying had happened this week. The British microchips were among some of the international components that were found in the missile and drones used in attacks on Ukraine at the weekend. Now, I don't know if that is true or not. And we don't even know whether the countries that exported those components knew where they were going. But when you have this such a complex web that you describe, it seems that there are always new loopholes that pop up to make it still continue.
Absolutely, and yeah, the shadow fleet, so-called shadow fleet. I mean, they're all over. They're a very, very important component of this Russian war machine in terms of feeding it with revenue. And I have to be careful what I say because I do transit through Turkey a lot. But you know, there's not many ways out of the Black Sea for Russian ships. They do have to go through the straits through Turkey to reach outer waters. And I always wonder when I do fly over Turkey, you see masses and masses of ships that are being serviced, refueled, and so on. How many of those are Russian, and how many of those are actually being checked to see if there's illicit cargo on board? The other thing is, I think we've also seen a weakness from what we would call democratic states, or the home of democracy, for heaven's sake. Greece seems to be opposing tough sanctions on the shadow fleet. Countries that flag these ships, developing countries, many of them, are also opposed to that. So those are the particular loopholes that are being exploited. So it's a mix of that, a lack of political will, and technology as well that's using to evade, turning off transporters, that sort of thing. But I really do believe that if there was a will, that this could be stopped pretty quickly. But I think we're living in a world, as you well know, where we're seeing this crumbling of the rules based international order. We're seeing disunity even in the EU. We saw that during COVID, but we're also seeing that when we were expecting on the fourth anniversary, the 20th EU sanctions package. The political support wasn't there. Hungary, among others, were opposing it, but also we didn't see the promised 90 billion or so loan backed by Russian assets come forth either. That really worries me because if that unity starts to break, and we could expect to see more leaders or parliamentarians elected that are not in support of backing Ukraine, it's not going to work in Ukraine's favor, but it will work in Mr. Putin's favor.
Yeah, and you mentioned there that in that lack of unity, you mentioned Hungary and prime example. I mean, the two examples you've already given there, but also the latest development that the Prime Minister is saying that Hungary is going to deploy soldiers and equipment to protect key energy infrastructure. It's claiming that there's a potential of a Ukrainian threat to the Druzhba pipeline, which supplies Hungary. That kind of position, that kind of rhetoric, and it also goes back to what you were saying earlier, that finding out what the real truth and the real facts are, it's so blurred, and people just use it for their own agenda, don't they?
Yeah. Well, look, for Mr. Orban, I think this is posturing. He is not doing well in the polls. He's facing an election, and that's what desperate authoritarian leaders do: is they find a reason to deploy the military and to look tough and to distract. And I don't want to draw a comparison between him and Mr. Trump, but they are buddies. And we're also wondering about the rationale of Mr. Trump's huge deployment, the so-called Armada near Iran, um, when diplomacy does seem to be a viable option at the moment. So, yeah, I don't put much credence into anything Mr. Orban says, but he does know how to manipulate the EU, and they have had from time to time to pay him off in one way or another. I'm not saying by bribes, but by favors that he doesn't deserve whatsoever. And these types of things really worry their neighbors too, like Poland, for example. Recent statements coming out of there saying that telling they're finally telling their people that Mr. Putin is not pushed back. They could be next, or the Baltic states could be next. It's a scary time for a lot of people in that region of the world.
Yeah, and today talks are due to take place after this conversation. Yet again, US-Ukraine talks in Geneva, and you mentioned Iran because the Steve Witkoff, who will be taking part in those talks, is going to be shuttling backwards and forwards between talks on Iran and talks with Ukraine. I mean, is there really any hope that anything will come out of this that's even vaguely positive for Ukraine?
Well, it's hard to say, but let me clarify a little point here. I hope to uh, contradict U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, but I just read earlier today a statement by him. I think it was from an interview where he said, the Trump administration is the first party to get the Russians and the Ukrainians together in this war. Well, that's not true. I remember early in the war, the two sides were meeting, not at a high level, but at a technical level to negotiate prisoner swaps, that sort of thing. A lot of that happened in Turkey. And, if we look back to 2014 when I was with the OSCE in Ukraine, Kate, unless I was hallucinating, we were across the table from the Russians as part of the OSCE, along with the Ukrainians. And, for example, when MH17 was brought down, how on earth were we given access to go monitor that whole tragedy? It was because the Ukrainians, the OSCE, were talking to the Russians, and they are still part of the OSCE. So, we're seeing these types of misstatements, but when it comes to the, Iran as well, it does look like the Iranian leadership are willing to make some concessions at the bargaining table, but they're not willing to give up the American claims, I believe, is about 400 kg of uranium and other stuff. And by the way, I think we were told that few months ago, the American bombers bombed that whole sector to oblivion. Well, apparently not. So I think the other thing that is making the United States somewhat reluctant to drop diplomacy and switch entirely to military means to somehow resolve this situation is that you see many countries in the region not giving overflight rights to the Americans. Because what everybody fears, and quite rightly, is an escalation. Let's not forget the enormous proxy forces Iran has in Yemen, but especially in Lebanon, Hezbollah, and elsewhere. Those can be activated at the flip of a switch. And also, many believe rather, that Iran has had time to restock its supply of missiles because, after all, they do have buddies like Russia. And if an attack were to happen, they will strike many places, including Israel, a key U.S. ally. Uh, this gives all of us reasons to be very anxious at the moment. I hope diplomacy does take its course. But one more thing I have to throw in, not to complicate matters too much, Kate, but also Mr. Trump, as you know, has unveiled this board of peace, which it does appear he's positioning to, in some respects, take the place of the UN as kind of a peace broker and as a traditional partner when conflicts happen, it's the UN to step in immediately. And that worries me because if you look at the list of some of its founding neighbors, founding neighbors, these are some of these gentlemen would would not look out of place in an orange jumpsuit. And it's not only me saying that because I don't want to get in trouble, but it's also, for example, the director of Asia Pacific for Human Rights Watch, who spoke right there just 2 or 3 weeks ago, described it the same way. Where When we're losing or a key institution, or the United States is trying to rob it of its credibility, one that, okay, of course the UN isn't always effective, but it's the only thing we have at the moment. And if the Americans try to dilute it or strip of its powers, I don't know where we're going to end up in a few years from now.
And given that whole scenario that you've described, it's still extremely hard for Ukraine to keep in the top of people's minds globally. And where you are in Bangkok right now, you're about to have a conversation on, it's described, fault lines, flashpoints, and the battle for influence. How high on the agenda is Ukraine likely to be where you are?
Pretty much, I am a panelist among many others. We're going to have three here and two virtually, journalists and experts. In our discussions and preparing for this year ahead panel, I think we've identified two or three things. One, of course, yeah, the war in Ukraine is important in and of itself, very much for even just symbolic reasons, territorial sovereignty, but also that everything is interconnected now. Like we were talking, for example, about the sanctions busting these very complex networks. But it seems, pretty much agreed upon by everybody is that, well, number one, China is casting a much bigger shadow over this part of the region. Um, there's a reason why, for example, those scam centers have had to literally scatter because China its foot down and told its buddies here in the region, crack down on it or else. But the other thing, and I never thought I would be putting these words together, but China, for them, what's happening geopolitically, especially with the United States retreating in some respects from the global stage, losing its moral authority. For example, with countries like Myanmar is now in China's influence, but China sees this as a golden moment to project itself as a responsible superpower. So, for example, continuing to fund a WHO, other initiatives in Africa to help maternal health. Goodness gracious. And
I know. I feel that coming, that you're about to say that when you said, I never thought I'd say this. But yes, it is quite a thought, isn't it?
Yeah, and one more thing here, Kate. Sorry, is that when you see, for example, my Prime Minister Mark Carney go to China, Keir Starmer went there, and business high on the agenda, but not much talk about human rights abuses. That's a new development too. Tells you a lot.
Very interesting, yeah, and very saddening as well. Just want to end on a thought that was expressed to us on Frontline this week, that Ukrainian victory was inevitable, was their opinion, because whereas Putin is fighting for his legacy, Ukraine is fighting for its very existence. Do you agree with that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a make or break moment for Ukraine. You and I did talk about for example, the demographic crisis, things like that. But it's really going to be, I think, decided over the next few weeks. Russia was not successful in trying to break the will of Ukrainians over the winter with these terrible code stops and really relentless pounding of infrastructure. I and many others believe if they can survive that, they can survive anything. But it's crucially important at this critical stage that the West do everything it can to give Ukraine what it's been asking for in terms of military needs, including long range weaponry, to strike deep inside Russia at the infrastructure, that enables the Russian war machine to function. Stop being afraid of Mr. Putin, is my message to Western leaders, because if you don't stop him now, he will be on your doorstep. So it's not only about Ukraine, it's about their future security as well. Let's be clear about that.
Michael Bociurkiw, as ever, it's been great talking to you. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Good to be with you again.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Kate Gerbeau, and for all the latest updates on the war in Ukraine and global security, you can subscribe to this channel and sign up for a membership. You can also listen to Frontline wherever you get your podcasts or on Times Radio at 1:30 a.m. UTC. And for all the latest news and analysis, you can visit thetimes.com. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye for now.